Welcome to Responsible AI, the podcast for the AI Forum. Here on the podcast, we engage in critical dialogue with legal minds, tech experts, and other big thinkers on AI's legal and societal impacts, offering deep dives into public policy and best practices. Responsible AI is hosted by Alex Albin, director of the AI Forum, and me, your producer, Rebecca Staffel. You can learn more at our website, theaiforum.org. We're talking today with Oumou Ly. Oumou Ly is a non-resident research fellow with the AI Security Initiative at UC Berkeley's Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, where she conducts applied research on the systemic risks that emerging technologies pose to global financial systems. As the senior advisor for technology and ecosystem security at the White House, she co-authored President Biden's 2023 executive order on artificial intelligence and played a pivotal role in developing national strategies to strengthen ecosystem-level technology security outcomes. Oumou also served in a presidentially appointed role at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where she led efforts to reduce cybersecurity risk. Prior to serving in the executive branch, Oumou was a fellow and researcher at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, where she co-authored the concept paper for Blue Sky Social, a public benefit corporation that hosts one of the first decentralized social networking platforms. Her commentary and research have appeared in The Hill, NBC News, and the Financial Times. Oumou Ly, welcome to the show, and hello, Alex Albin.
Hello, Oumou. It's really lovely having you on the podcast, and we appreciate your time.
It is equally lovely to be with you. Thank you for having me.
We're going to get into a variety of questions, some about your government career, some about your academic career. I would love to get your thoughts on what is happening in the technology and AI industry and policymaking in general. And maybe we'll start with some of your government experience, as you did work in President Biden's White House, and you were one of the architects of the executive order of 2023 regarding artificial intelligence. I think I'm one of the few people who's actually read the entire 120-page executive order, which I am told was the longest executive order ever issued by a president in the history of the Republic. Well, tell us a little about that experience. That really must have been fascinating. And I'm interested in the entire process, the origin of, does the president say we should be doing something about AI? What are we doing about AI? How does that work?
Yeah. So I'll couch you in the moment in time. The office of the White House that I was in was called the Office of the National Cyber Director. It was a relatively new office created in 2021 to be the lead advisor to the president on cybersecurity policy and strategy. I served on a team called Technology and Ecosystem Security. This was the team that was responsible for looking across the digital landscape, studying the preconditions for systemic risk across that landscape, and creating regulations, standards, policy, guidance, and other resources for industry to improve some of the risk conditions that we saw when we did that survey. I came to the White House in 2023, and around that time, because GPT-3 was released in the fall of 2022, there was a lot of buzz around AI. So we began the process, not necessarily of writing an executive order to start, but of figuring out what kind of action the administration should be taking around this. There was an AI Bill of Rights released by the Office of Science and Technology Policy. There was the AI Risk Management Framework that was released by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, around that time as well. But we did not really have a comprehensive view of the landscape, a comprehensive policy approach to AI sort of writ large. Early in the spring of 2023, shortly after I started, there were what we call deputies committee meetings. You have reps from the National Security Cluster that might include ONCD, where I sat, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, definitely the National Security Council. Then you'll also have some of the other offices around the White House who have equities in the process. And that really, because the technology was so diffuse and so widespread and such a huge topic of policy conversation, really turned out to be most of the offices in the White House. So there were deputies committee meetings where we're trying to decide what kinds of issues, when it comes to AI, should the executive branch really be concerned with? What is our role in driving down some of the risk we can anticipate? What really should be our role in establishing the right kinds of guardrails that help mitigate some of that risk. I think by the time we hit summer, there was just a growing internal and external recognition that this wasn't going away, and we really were going to have to architect some meaningful, more robust body of policy around this. So we began the drafting process over that summer. The executive order was released that fall, and really it was just sort of a consultative process. It began with the deputies committee. There's a lot of staff level work, writing, negotiation that goes into it. There were various offices that had the pen on certain sections. My office, for example, we wrote the sections on bringing AI talent into the federal workforce, few sections on dual use foundation models. And through this sort of negotiation process, we ended up with the final product, which I think you said ended up being the longest executive order ever issued. And then we began the process of implementing really shortly after it was released. And that it really sort of tracks with other processes that I've long been a part of to produce things like this. I spent some time working for Senator, or I should say Leader Schumer now from New York. And the process of passing legislation really is very similar. You'll introduce a bill, maybe there's another bill in the same domain. You'll have a conference, you'll have some discussion, you'll have some spirited negotiations, and then there's a final product that comes to the floor. And this really followed much of the same process.
Umu, what do you think the major accomplishments were of that executive order? You did draw together a tremendous amount of opinion. You worked, I think, really hard to come up with some sensible
Yeah.
guidelines for industry and for government. And what are you proudest of in terms of that achievement?
Yeah, the main thing I'd say is more meta. It's the fact that the process of writing this executive order, I think, catalyzed a sense of engagement from all parts of this ecosystem, from civil society to academics to government researchers to international partners. And that sort of ecosystem and that coalition, so to speak, still exists today. And there is a lot of, I think, policy attention to things like standards, metrics, guardrails in a way that there was not at scale before we wrote the executive order. And that really is what I'm most proud of, even more than any of the specific provisions that me or my team was able to make sure were included.
Does that give you some confidence that people can work across disciplines, across cybersecurity, privacy, technology to come together on these issues?
Absolutely. I would say that that kind of cross-disciplinary, cross-sector collaboration was a sort of defining of my time, not just in the White House, but in the administration as well. In the role I had immediately before the White House, I was at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, or CISA for short. And in that job, we were not a new agency, but we had just gotten a lot of new money, a lot of new authorities from Congress. And one of the big areas of focus for the committees of jurisdiction where that had oversight over CISA was the sense of private-public collaboration, specifically operational collaboration, threat information sharing, intel sharing, to get out ahead of some of the risks that we observe. And I know that we're going to talk about this later on in the interview, but the risk landscape is so diffuse that there is really no single actor or no single grouping of actors that can drive down risk at scale or effectuate some of the cybersecurity outcomes that we really want to see at scale. So working together really is the secret sauce. And sometimes I think it just really makes sense to bring together groups of stakeholders who don't normally talk to each other. And I think that is really how you get some of the most forward-looking, robust, long-lasting, energizing collaboration between people, but also the best products.
We're talking to Oumou Ly, who's the senior fellow for the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Oumou, just a few more thoughts on the Biden executive order. I read the Biden approach to AI, and please comment on this, as a
Mhm.
little more hortatory directive towards what government should be doing. In other words, these are the best practices. This is what I'd like to see out of the federal government. But to my mind, it didn't really have a lot of directives towards industry as much. Is that a true assessment of that executive order?
So there I think that's fair-ish. I think that's true-ish. There were, I think, a good mix of directives between government and industry. For government, for example, we're concerned really with things like consumer protection issues, privacy, redress, non-discrimination. Industry is going to be concerned with many of those same things, but not necessarily to the same extent. They're concerned more with security, with compliance issues in the jurisdictions where that is relevant for them, those sorts of issues. And so we tried, I think, to strike enough of a balance, but I think you'll see in some of the later products we released after the executive order, there were things that we tried to sort of make sure that we got on the back end. There was a series, for example, of voluntary commitments that 7 companies made to invest in safe, responsible, trustworthy AI, and those were a grouping of the big players. But some of the things that we asked those companies to do were things that weren't necessarily included in the executive order the first time around, or were things that were negotiated out the first time around.
I remember during that time that there was a famous congressional hearing, probably a Senate hearing, where the heads of the large language models were hauled before Congress, and Mark Zuckerberg was there, and so was Sam Altman. And they were all told, we need to regulate you. And they played a game of what I would call rope-a-dope, where they all said, sure, we would love to be regulated. That is the best idea. Regulation is the thing our industry needs. And I think that froze Congress to say, oh, well, then we would have to come up with something that makes sense. We'll get back to you.
Mhm.
Why is it so hard, actually, to get something done in the legislative arena?
Yeah, well, partly because the incentives among the big players are competing. Government has the mandate to act in the interest of the people, and that means really investing policy attention and industry attention in things like fairness, consumer protection issues, non-discrimination. And as we've seen, I think over the past 20 years or so, as we've tried to regulate tech, that there are corporate behaviors and that come from various places, that come from incentives from investors, from shareholders and other stakeholders that directly cause companies to have interests that contravene the interest of government. And so what we have then is rounds of talks on an executive order, for example, just as many rounds of stalemates as we have rounds of talks. And we end up with, I think, good-ish, like, negotiated end products that do accomplish something. They do move the needle a bit. They do establish a set of benchmarks, but they don't necessarily go as far as they need to go in either direction. And so we end up with, sort of teeter-tottering and uh, trying to incrementally correct what we were not able to get each time we instantiate a policy or create regulation.
I would agree with that. And my personal experience has been being involved in privacy initiatives, some bills that actually do get drafted by Congress and eventually go to one committee.
Yeah.
But Congress over the last 20 years has not been able to pass a global privacy law.
Yeah.
And yet, if you actually talk to individual members, regardless of party, they will all say, we love privacy and we would love to see a privacy law. But when you get 435 of them together in a room, they don't seem to be able to do anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of frustration maybe that we're all going to feel for those of us in the policy world.
Yeah. I worked in Congress for 4 years. I worked for Senator Schumer for 2 years before he became the Democratic leader and for 2 years after, so 2 years into the Trump administration. And around that time, we started to see a little bit more action on issues like CDA 230, if you're familiar, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides a liability shield to companies who are third-party producers of certain content or provide the platform for third parties to produce certain kinds of speech and content. And it was interesting to me that this became sort of the flashpoint issue in tech. Like, tech is not a bread and butter issue necessarily in the United States. People don't vote on privacy. They don't vote on how well you're going to shore up and secure their open source software. They vote on, like,
Bread and butter.
bread and butter, literally bread and butter.
The price of bread and butter.
The price of bread and butter and eggs. And so I think that sort of flashpoint really was a good lesson and why it's so difficult to regulate tech, I think. There are a range of competing incentives. Tech itself has become so politicized in a way that it wasn't at the outset. So there's a lot to sort through. There's a lot to make sense of, which is part of why I loved the job I did at the White House, because I had the ability to just sort of look across the entire landscape and figure out, why exactly do these things happen? Why can we not agree on this? Why can't we establish basic common sense regulations that we know will improve customer security outcomes, help people live better, actually support innovation? There are many politicized sort of issues and fights, and they go much deeper than I think that many of us realize or know when we're engaged in them.
We are talking to Oumou Ly, who is a fellow at UC Berkeley, a senior fellow at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Oumou, we would like to get your perspective on what you think the socio-technical factors are that do lead to systemic cybersecurity risks.
So the term socio-technical, I'll take this bit by bit, is about the interplay between systems and humans. But I'll take the slightly longer way to answer this question. I in my prior role in the White House on technology and ecosystem security, which is this team that I worked on, we studied preconditions for adverse systemic impact. Why is it that we get these huge cascading cybersecurity events that take entire hospital systems, government systems, school systems offline? And we studied this, I think, in particular in the context of ransomware. If I had to inventory the risk conditions that lead to systemic ransomware, it's that crypto payments allow ransomware actors to take payments anonymously. Victims will often take the ransom, which makes it a cost of doing business. The malware variants, they're constantly changing, which makes it difficult for defenders to get out ahead of them. And in that example, in ransomware, the non-traditional digital payment systems, the combination of like limited understanding and limited education among the end users work together to produce these impacts. And I think from SolarWinds to Colonial Pipeline to Kaseya, we definitely saw those impacts. So for AI products, a socio-technical systems approach to looking at this risk, I think, shows that a similar combination of risk factors can work together to produce the same kinds of risks and the same kinds of outcomes. But it's concerning, I think, because AI can really accelerate and automate some of these risks, and the impacts will be really graver than anything that we've had to date.
Can you maybe give us an example of how AI will exacerbate these risks?
Let's say, for example, there are um, companies out there building autonomous vehicles, and that to build those technologies, data has to be sourced from like certain types of data blenders if you want the technology to be secure. Sensor fusion models have to be sourced from data brokers that adhere to certain kinds of standards for data security, data handling, data provenance, and those sorts of things. So maybe that may be the case today, that may not be the case today. But we know that when an algorithm is deployed, when an autonomous vehicle hits the streets, there are all sorts of new attack vectors, new cybersecurity attack vectors that arise as a result of some of the decisions that system makes being automated and not having a human in the loop. And that's just one example.
Right. What do you think about this concept of security by design? In the privacy world, we have a concept of privacy by design where we would
Yeah.
like to see companies at the very early development stage of a product think about the data issues and
Mhm.
think about where that data might end up in unintended ways. Tell us a little bit about how you think security by design should be implemented.
So, secure by design, it's a concept that's emerged over the past couple of years to give developers a language and a set of principles to refer to when talking about taking a socio-technical systems approach to AI risk. It's literally a way to talk about socio-technical systems risk reduction. And it's a huge feat of public policy. A couple of things I'd say. One is that cybersecurity, up until this point, has been a relatively like piecemeal effort. It's been up to smaller organizations, end users, victims of cyber attacks to compensate for security failures in the systems that they often get from the bigger technology manufacturers. And secure by design, I think, is a recognition that the smaller players can't on their own drive down the risk that we observe at sufficient scale to stop the harm from occurring. And it treats security as a design constraint. So for AI, Because AI is ultimately a type of software product, you're going to do many of the same things: anticipate attacks, reduce the attack surface, institute vulnerability identifiers, do all the things that you'd normally do because ultimately AI is a type of software. But also ask, like, what tools and controls are you going to implement pre-deployment to obviate and mitigate some of those risks? What policy and procedures are in place? What mechanisms are going to support ongoing post-deployment continuous monitoring and adaptation such that the risk is effectively dropped down, and what metrics you're going to use to track AI effectiveness. I think one of the things that makes AI really tricky when thinking about secure by design and thinking about socio-technical systems is that the model itself becomes part of the socio-technical feedback loop. The model itself is part of the social environment that then creates the risk conditions. And that is really new. That is totally novel. So there are a range of like new and emerging risk management practices. I'm actually working on one at Berkeley that addresses some of this as well, that have to take into account the fact that the technology itself has become autonomous enough to require certain kinds of behaviors that then hopefully drive down some of that risk.
It's a very complicated
Yeah,
subject. We say it's like trying to drive the car while building the car.
absolutely.
One of the things that you got involved in, one of the things that I talk about in my cybersecurity class that has a lot of people worried is ransomware. And I think that you were on a joint ransomware task force at one point.
I did. I led the effort to develop metrics to measure how well our interventions against ransomware were working.
How are our interventions against ransomware working? At least then.
Yeah. So at the time, this is again, this was in a prior role before the White House. This was at CISA in 2020, 2021, and 2022, when ransomware was really all the rage. The Biden administration started, I think, within a month of the SolarWinds attack having been discovered. So this was high on the list, top of mind. And when I started leading that piece of the Joint Ransomware Task Force, part of the task was just to collect data about what really was going on. How many ransomware events were we seeing across what sectors, using what malware variants, according to what TTP tactics, tools, and procedures, all of that sort of stuff. And it really struck me that as a government, we did not have that information already. And so we had to build the mechanisms to do that. One of the ways that we did that was by Congress passing something called CERCIA, the Cybersecurity Incident Reporting Act. And I'm so sorry that I do not remember the full acronym.
It's a
um,
Nobody does.
Nobody does. Thank you for that. Once CERCIA was implemented, we started getting, I think, a better, more steady stream of risk data flowing in, and we were then able to develop like measurement frameworks to kind of test, like, if we, for example, institute this set of mitigations against this particular malware variant, or we take this set of actions, law enforcement actions against these ransomware actors, what then percent of risk reduction or incident prevalence do we then see? And over time, I think that the results were good-ish. I remember seeing a 51% decrease in attacks on government entities within about a year after I started undertaking this work. But I think also that the data still, we really still need a fuller picture of the entire landscape.
I remember I was watching TV, a news program, and I saw one of my Stanford colleagues working for the NSA saying that the US government should not pay cybersecurity and ransomware
Mhm.
and instructed companies in the private sector also not to pay ransomware.
Yes. Yes.
If you remember that episode, did you have any thoughts on that as to whether that was a good policy or not?
I very much support that policy. I very much agree with it. I have to say that partly because I wrote so many of the of the products we released saying don't do that. But we say it for a couple of different reasons. One is that it just trains the bad guys to think that they can come after you time and time again. That's one. Two is that it sort of socializes firms into thinking that paying the ransom is just sort of the part of the cost of doing business. And it completely I think trivializes the really important issue, which is that ransomware actors now have not only knowledge that they can do this and get away with it, but they also now have access to critical systems that then can really, really, really cause some catastrophic outcomes. So yeah, I say don't pay it.
Okay, fair enough. Then what I tell anybody who will listen on this subject is back up your data, but not just back up your data, learn how to retrieve your data when it's backed up. It turns out that in some of the major cyber attacks, like the Colonial Pipeline attack,
Yeah.
they had backed up their data. And yet it took them so long to recover it that they
Mhm.
were effectively shut down anyway, and then decided to pay the ransom so that they could get it back quicker than their IT department could deliver. Well,
Yeah.
how are we proactive there?
This is one of the big reasons I love talking about secure by design because it is the idea that companies can and should take a holistic approach to making sure not only that their systems are secure, but their data is available in the event of an attack like this. So it'll take years, maybe decades for the right kinds of cultural and organizational changes to happen that make it intuitive for product teams, for engineering teams, for security teams to have those backups on the ready. But this is why we do the work. It's constant education with hope that at some point we'll see different outcomes.
I want to expand on that thought a minute, because you use the word culture.
Mhm.
We talk about a culture of cybersecurity and the importance of not just leaving cybersecurity to the IT guys. How would you and what are you doing to broaden this idea that organizations have to develop this culture of
Uh,
cybersecurity?
well, I have to tell you, I think the shift really has to come from customers and from consumer advocates. I think enough users of technology really have to demand that manufacturers design products in a way that doesn't externalize such a huge cross section of risk. Like, it's not enough for a company to tell you buy the warranty or to issue patches or software updates. They have to take more responsibility over customer security outcomes. One of my really good colleagues from CISA is cybersecurity luminary named Bob Lord. He had previously been the head of security at Twitter, Yahoo, at the Democratic National Committee. And one of the things that he will often say is read Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader. In that book, I think it was written in the 70s or the 80s.
I think 60s.
60s? 60s.
Yeah,
He talks about how in the 60s, Chevrolet was selling cars with serious design flaws, I think mainly that they didn't have seat belts.
correct.
And that expose helped catalyze this shift in expectations that forced automakers to start thinking about embedding safety into the design of products. You can't just like you can't sell the seat belt separately. You have to sell it as part of the product. And I think that same kind of mentality shift really will be what shifts organizational cultures, and shifts the outcomes that we see at scale. Like I said earlier, like tech, privacy, cybersecurity are not necessarily bread and butter issues, but I think part of what needs to happen is that they really should be, and not just the speech issues, the things that really affect people, consumers, and really our everyday lives because tech is so integrated with our everyday comings and goings. These really are the things that should happen.
It does have an impact when a consumer makes a complaint and the company hears it. And
Yeah.
just a little bit off topic, my mother was actually someone who arranged Ralph Nader's lecture engagements and arranged him to be picked up at a college. And the college student had an old Corvair, which is Chevrolet, which had no seatbelts.
Mhm.
And Mr. Nader apparently refused to get in the car
Oh, man.
and therefore canceled the engagement. This
Wow.
a man who's lives by his word, I guess. But it does make sense when consumers make this an issue. And I tell my class, we have all these billboards in Los Angeles of tort lawyers who are suing for accidents and all their kinds of things. But when we start seeing the billboards for sue for data breach or
Yeah.
sue for your California consumer privacy rights,
Right.
then we'll start seeing some movement here.
That's exactly right. The people really, really have to drive it, and they have to they'll be the ones to really make a difference, I think.
Which might lead us to a little bit of a discussion of modern culture and social networks. And I
Mhm.
don't know if this is too far back in your past, but you did write a paper on Blue Sky Social
Yeah.
or collaborated on a paper when you were at the Berkman Klein Center. Can
Yep.
you tell us a little about Blue Sky Social and what that
Yes.
entailed?
Yes, absolutely. So, couching us in time again. Think about it. It's 2020. The pandemic is raging. There's no vaccine yet. There are all sorts of free speech issues flying around. CDA 230 is the main tech issue in policy circles and out in the news. And Jack Dorsey has just stepped down as the CEO of Twitter. We started having conversations as academics, but also as policy people, about what distributed social networks could look like. And distributed meaning not data not housed by a singular actor or a company, but operated by what we call a ledger or blockchain, where data is stored locally, and the user has the same ability to interact with other users, interact with other servers, but their data is stored locally. The thinking behind this is that it could be sort of a new way or a quicker way of creating data protections that we likely were not going to get through social media regulation or some of the other policy efforts that were stood up around that time. And in that paper, we lay out a couple of different things. One is, what should the business model of a company like this look like? Should we have a board? Should there be shareholders? Should it be publicly traded? We thought long and hard about the content moderation and provenance around it. Should we have a community managed content moderation process? Should there be a centralized moderation process? Should we have terms of service? What should those terms of service look like? How far or how much do we want to take advantage of the third-party liability that CDA 230 gives us as non-publishers? And we also talked about, like, what kind of world would a platform like this really be successful? What are the socio-technical, really, but like both technical and social factors that surround systems like this that would help more of them crop up and then scale, and in the process reduce some of the pressure on the existing platforms to quote unquote get it right, or moderate in the right way. So it was fantastic work. It was really, really exciting. It led to, very obviously, the creation of this company, Blue Sky. But I'm hopeful that more models like this will begin to spring up, especially as new organizations of the web like Web3 really start to take hold over the next couple of years.
Right. I mean, talking about one of the stakeholders that actually might be able to influence organizational behavior, corporate behavior, are investors. Have you been thinking about what approaches investors can actually use to pressure companies to have better cybersecurity practices?
I am so glad that you asked about this. So I'm at UC Berkeley right now. I'm working on a project on exactly this, designing governance and risk oversight mechanisms for investors specifically. Taking a socio-technical systems approach to AI risk, and looking at AI in the context of its total life cycle and its total product chain. Investors are really critical nodes in managing AI risk across the landscape of what we call at scale. And that's really for two reasons. One is that investors are really driving the AI revolution or the widespread adoption of AI across the economy. And just for a few stats, like global spending on AI is expected to reach, I think, $1.5 trillion in 2025. VC investment, according to KPMG, rose to 368 billion over more than 35,000 deals. And in the United States, US-based VCs accounted for over 200 billion of this total.
Right.
And so in the first half, like, AI startups in the US are receiving 64% of all VC dollars invested.
And you think those VCs could actually influence their cultures on security?
I think so, and let me tell you why. The volume and pace of capital formation is so significant, and at the same time, we don't have really strong regulation in any given jurisdiction. So this leaves, like, investors, corporate boards, and investor intermediaries deciding, like, do we just kind of do our own thing? Do we adopt some of these voluntary measures? It's like much more likely that if their funders or capital providers create requirements, they're going to follow those over voluntary requirements. And so at Berkeley, we're now researching this. We've had conversations with VCs, both traditional and corporate, with regulators across jurisdictions, with the AI developers and their boards, really to understand what they perceive their role in reducing AI risk to be, what AI use cases are really prevalent in their environments, what kinds of governance and oversight mechanisms make sense given their priorities, current regulatory burdens, etc. And actually on December 8th, we're having a private convening to talk through these issues exactly. The thing I want to highlight though is that when you're an investor, the first thing you kind of say is like, okay, is this going to be relevant to me, to my environment? And I really would say it would be a good thing. Not only would investors, I think, more meaningfully participate in reducing risk, but they'd also be able to do some of the things that they care about doing well and do those things better, capturing efficiency gains, expanding the number of viable use cases, strengthening model performance, level setting value, increasing the value that companies derive from AI and the overall value of AI companies themselves. These
Right.
are all things that investors want and should do. And if they can, in the process, improve the risk conditions to society, risk to themselves, risk to the environment, or what have you, that would be a very good thing too.
This leads me to maybe a final note about AI and who's accountable for AI. I
Yeah.
don't know. If you look across the scope of the work that you've been doing over the last few years, what do you think are the big accountability gaps right now when we talk about AI products and the implementation of these products and their use by the public? Do you have a thesis on that?
I do. Yes. One of the dilemmas that companies often have is that they'll say, okay, we can either spend time in design with security teams, engineering teams, figuring out how to reduce the number of patches we need to issue upon deployment, or we can make sure that these products ship to market on schedule. And given that choice, the companies will very often choose the second. No surprise there. There arises this tension, this dilemma then. That's like, okay, if we decide that we're going to ship these products out on schedule, what then happens to security? Security then has to fall by the wayside. There then introduces this tension that I think sort of muddies this issue of accountability. Who is accountable if both of these equally important competing factors don't necessarily have enough space in the internal environment to actually materialize, actually manifest. And those issues it just sort of scales out. It's not just the issue in one firm; it's the issue across really all the manufacturers, big and small. And so the issue of accountability is one. It's tough because government really is responsible to it has a mandate to protect people, the environment, society, public health, etc. Companies have their priorities. Customers have their own priorities as well. I think really the answer is that we all have a piece. We all are accountable in some way. Every piece of the socio-technical product chain or risk chain has a role. I think it's a matter of getting each actor to really see their role accurately, understand what they can actually do, and then go do it.
That really strikes me as a good overview of the challenges that our society faces now with the rapid adoption of a new technology that really isn't very well understood. One of the things that I worry about, Umu, is AI education among the public.
Mhm. Yeah.
How do we address this issue in 1 minute or less?
This is a tough one, Alex. So, again, when I was at the White House, we wrote something called the National Cyber Workforce and Education Strategy. We wrote this kind of pre AI. We were finalizing the product as AI became a really big topic. And one of the things we say in there is that the idea of full functional literacy has changed. It's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic anymore. It's reading, writing, arithmetic, and digital literacy, and computational literacy, and the ability to work with technology, and the ability sometimes to integrate an understanding of technology and use it in your existing work. Part of the answer is that it really begins in young childhood because to exist in this world as a fully functioning human and to have all of the range of opportunities that you want to have. Yes, I see your smartphone there. Yes, we all have one of those in our pockets. As young as possible, you need to have the ability to work with digital systems, not be afraid of them and be able to work with them as they continue to evolve, mature and get more advanced. So that's part of it. I think the second thing is that I talked really recently about this tension between innovation and security or innovation and regulation. That tension I think spills over into the way that we talk about tech and the way we educate people and indoctrinate people into tech as well. Um, there, for example, we had a bunch of different initiatives to get engineers programming in memory-safe programming languages with hope that that would reduce the number of code vulnerabilities in commonly used software. The engineers then say, well, if we code in memory-safe programming languages, well, then we have less time to do all of the really important other things. But I think a socio-technical systems approach to this says this thing is just as important as the other thing. The learning how to code and the organizational processes that wrap around them and the way that we train engineers to code matters just as much as the code that they produce. And so I think part of what we really need to do is think about how to change the thinking and how to change the mental model around what it means to educate people and give people digital skills, give people digital literacy, both for lay people and for people who are actually building the tech.
I think that's a really important perspective to share about how we need to address the digital literacy issue and have a continuing conversation about this.
Mhm.
Well, speaking about continuing conversation, is there an area that you were dying to talk about that we missed or a question that we missed?
Yes. Yeah. So we're at Berkeley right now building a framework, one, to give investors better visibility into AI use cases and risks associated with those use cases, but two, to help them create and establish the right mitigations that map to those risks and to those use cases. We've had conversations with a range of different stakeholders on this topic, including investors, regulators, AI security practitioners and researchers, really a cross-sector grouping of people relevant to this topic to delve into what a framework like that might look like. What kinds of oversight mechanisms or controls are investors most likely to use? What are regulators across jurisdictions already asking for? How do we not duplicate that effort? And how do we make sure that we instantiate mechanisms for ongoing, continuous monitoring and evaluation of how those models are actually performing in the wild? On December 8th, we will have a Chatham House convening to talk about this, hosted by UC Berkeley. The event will be held virtually. And if you would like an invitation, please email cltc@berkeley.edu for more information or to request an invitation.
Excellent. We will send you an email. We have been speaking with Oumou Ly, who is a senior fellow at UC Berkeley. We've been talking about cybersecurity issues and AI issues, both from the perspective of someone who's worked in academia and worked in government and now is doing some exciting work in cybersecurity and the investment community. Oumou, thank you so much for being with us on the Responsible AI podcast.
I had a blast. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Oumou Ly, for joining us on the Responsible AI podcast from the AI Forum. You can subscribe to the Responsible AI podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you like to listen. See what we've been reading about the legal and ethical implications of AI on our website, theaiforum.org.